Okay, we're in the second problem part of the book of 1 Corinthians. It has two big problem sections and then a series of questions that he's going to answer. So when you have this problem coming up first, he needed to get them unified because they were divided up. They were around personalities. They needed to deal with that. But then we get to chapter 5, and he now says, well, we got another problem. And that other problem is that you've got a man who's taken his father's wife, and all of you seem to not only be fine with it, but celebrating it and acting like you're the great, loving, spiritual people in this process by letting that sin continue in your midst. He says, that's not right at all. He says, I don't have to be there to know that this is wrong and needs to be addressed. And so he tells them then they need to purge out the old leaven, using that illustration, that metaphor of leaven, to start that which has a characteristic of getting in and seeping out and just affecting everything around it. You've got to get on top of this, is what he's saying, for the sake of the soul, for the sake of the congregation, for the sake of everyone there. So then, as we looked at beginning last week, in the paragraph that really began in verse 9, he then wants to clarify something. Because he says, I wrote to you in my epistle not to keep company with sexually immoral people. Yet I certainly did not mean with the sexually immoral people of this world, or the covetous, or extortioners, or idolaters, since then you would need to go out of the world. But now I have written to you not to keep company with anyone named a brother, who is sexually immoral, or covetous, or an idolater, or a reviler, or a drunkard, or an extortioner, not even to eat with such a person. And the key element that we were looking at is this contrast that he is making here between, look, when I said this, that you have a responsibility not to be mixed up together with people that have these problems, that are these kind of sins. He says, it should have been clear I was not talking about people in the world. Those people in the world, they're going to just do that. That's how they are. And you'd have to go out of the world to get away from people if you're going to do that. That clearly was not what I meant when I said that. What I meant was, when I told you don't to be mixed up with them, is it should not be part of you in your gathering, in your relationship. You should not allow that kind of sin to commingle among God's people. He says, that's what I was talking about. And it's one of those things that should have been obvious, and he's like, I'm not sure why you missed this part of the conversation, but that's what I was talking about. And then he adds on to it, and this is what we did not quite get to last week. Not even to eat, he says. Not even to eat with such a person. Okay. So they had started off and looked at their situation and said, well, we're fine here and we're protective here, but they had basically accepted what amounted to an anything goes in here scenario, as if they were apart from any of these problems. He says, that's not it. But then he adds this, when he says not to be mixed up together, and this is where it gets hard for us, we've got to figure some things out. That includes, and therefore is characterized by things like not even to eat together. Not even to eat together is one big example of what he means by don't be mixed up together with them and don't keep company with them. It's one big example of that. Okay? So he is basically saying, here is what you shouldn't be doing. When I'm talking about this, I want to clarify who I mean. I mean members in the congregation that are in sin. Shouldn't be mixed up together with them. And I mean to this degree. You should avoid that. Now, that automatically produces some questions if we start wanting to apply it. And usually this is what happens, is we start saying, we get ahead of ourselves a little bit, actually, and we start wanting to say, well, what about this scenario? We love going to hypotheticals, right? Everybody loves a good hypothetical, except the person having to answer the hypothetical. Okay? I don't actually mind hypotheticals, except we tend to want to ask the hypothetical before we've bothered to study the thetical. Right? So you have to understand what he's saying first in its context, and then we apply it. Now we know what we're talking about when we get to hypotheticals. When we try to answer a hypothetical, now we have to, and we haven't studied it, we go back and try to bring all this up, then people have all sorts of excuses. So let's consider what he is saying. Number one, big principle. Don't be mixed up together with them. How far does that go? What does it mean to be mixed up together? Well, by saying not to even eat with them, gives it a context that he's talking about some kind of social interaction. We know this when you look and go back. Eating together was considered in that time period, perhaps, the apex of what you enjoyed in terms of fellowship and community. It was certainly that way among the Romans. It was that way for the Greeks. Meals were a big deal. Okay? They did not have all the different means of entertainment that we have. Right? They didn't go out to, see the latest movie. Didn't do that. They had plays they could go to, but those were really for the upper crust mostly. You had different events going on, but this was something all the time that you did that was we're together. It's what you did to say that we belong together. If you go to the movies, you're not actually making a statement about that you belong with all the people there. At least I hope not. Right? I just came to see the movie. Right? The meal is more specific. That is, we share something important in common that brings us together. And it is a social expression of a higher togetherness. That is the nature of it socially. Okay. Now, just we're going to test this out a little bit. I said we needed to get practical. When you think about, because I'm not going to have you project forward, because then we start protecting ourselves a little bit. So I want you to now look backwards at the last several meals that you've enjoyed. Okay, now, who have you had those with? Okay. Hopefully family is in there, otherwise we need to talk afterwards, right? But put family in there. Okay. What else after that? What now? Usually it's people from church, maybe extended family. I know that's true for us. People from here, we go out afterwards. I know that was, we did that Friday night. We did that on Sunday. That's normal, right? How many of you have ever gone walking down the street, seen a stranger, and said, "Hey, want to do lunch?" Okay, hopefully you understand the point. Is that while we don't actually think about it much, there is a main important social element to eating that says you are in the company of someone where there's trust. Now, we try to invite people who are, hopefully with hospitality, people we don't know, right? What are we trying to do when you invite someone in who is not already established as your group? What are you trying to do with them? Aren't you trying to establish trust and establish a relationship? That's why you do it. That's the nature of what hospitality, the root word, means basically turning strangers into friends. That's the nature of it. Okay, so there is a trust component, there's a social component. It has to do with meaning of, it's about relationships. Sharing a meal together is an expression, and for them, a high expression of a shared relationship. I think it was important to go through all of that for us to appreciate, going back into the text, what he's saying. Why does he add, not even to eat? Because what are you saying if you go ahead and have this meal with somebody who is mixed up in sin, that he has said you need to purge out the leaven, you need to not keep company with, you need to not be mixed up together, and then you want to have a meal with them. You say, hey, let's go out. Do this. We're going to go over to the game. We're going to go and catch lunch on Friday. What have we done at that point? It's about a relationship, isn't it? That's right. Because what has happened is we've changed nothing about our relationship. The relationship, those expressions of relationship, are saying nothing about the sin. If anything, they're saying the sin is acceptable to us. That was the problem they had. Okay? That's why he addresses it in this way. Why? Because if you move through this text, what he's getting to, the whole point is that you need to understand where that soul is with God. That person's lost, right? Turn them over to Satan. That's where they are. Right? That's verse 4 and 5. Then you need to purge out. You need to recognize the danger they pose, verses 6 through 8. And now you need to change your behavior with purpose. So he is expanding upon what it means to purge out the old leaven here in these verses to explain we have to change our behavior toward the person who is lost if they're going to ever get the point. Now, yes, go ahead. Yes. Okay, very good. Romans 1:32 closes with the problem, the sin of approving of these kinds of sin, not just committing them, but showing your approval in some way. Now, with this, what we're talking about, it is tacit approval. That is, you're acting like nothing's wrong. If you've got someone in sin, and we all know people, and I imagine we probably all have family members in this situation, is my guess. Unless your family members are not even members of the church, which can be true too. But what he's dealing with is, you've got someone in sin, the thing they need to know most is that they're in sin. Now, there's a right way and a wrong way to do this. We've tried to stress this throughout. But we can't just go on and act like everything's the same and normal. You've got to change your behavior. There have to be certain things that are pulled out. Now, this is the point when you get into 2 Thessalonians 3 and verse 6, when he says, withdraw yourself. It's funny because we talk about withdrawing fellowship, right? That terminology. Everyone pretend like you understand what I just said. Okay? You've heard that. Withdrawing fellowship. That wording is actually, those two words are not ever put together in the text. I understand the concept is, he wants to withdraw yourself. It's a more personal behavior. You are to withdraw personally. Not just make an announcement, but change the distance between you and them. Why? Because they're not listening to the scriptures on their own, or they wouldn't be in this situation. But that also means, and here's where it gets really interesting, it means they also have not listened to God's word being explained to them from us, from the outside too, right? Now, why do I say that we can put that in there? Paul didn't say that specifically here, did he? But in Matthew 18, in terms of principles about needing to go and talk to the person that is in sin, there is the nature of a process that ought to be there that would, why would we think that they would ever correct if they're not ever taught they're wrong? You just wave at them and think magically they understand it. If they understood that, maybe there wouldn't be a problem. They need that connection and instruction in a very personal way. Maybe they didn't get the message when it was a sermon preached to everybody. Maybe they didn't understand it. That could happen. Maybe they just never felt connected in with everybody, and therefore they didn't apply themselves to learn it. Maybe they're being rebellious, and that's really where we are here. But the point is that you have to recognize that whatever the reason, there ought to be a conversation with them to find out why they're doing what they're doing. Now, this is true all the time going on, but we need to build on that. Yes, Star. Okay, good. I'm glad. We're going to get there. Can you hang on? Yeah, that's good because I'm 17 minutes in and I haven't gotten past 11. And that's not your fault. Yes, okay. Hey, because he's going to talk about judging next. Okay. There's a process, it's implied if they are wrong, and why you turn them over to Satan is they've been unwilling to listen. Okay. They haven't been willing to respond. In other words, he knows they know better, and that's where they're going, and they're just doing it. Now, some people, they need to encourage. Sometimes, when I say encouragement, I mean encouragement to do right, meaning it's not just, hey, hang in there. I'm saying biblical encouragement, bring the Bible out. Okay. You don't get credit for doing a Bible study if you'd ever bring the Bible out. Okay, everybody? Okay. You maybe had a religious conversation, didn't have a Bible study. So you have to go out and say, okay, let's talk about what God says about this problem. Maybe they don't want to. But you need to have those and explain it because they need to hear God's side. Usually those people are hurt. They're hurting and they're upset and their minds are anywhere but on God at that moment, which is why they're where they are. And so we have to get their minds there. That's part of this process. And you start with conversation. You start with as the people closest, but you continue that until you don't give up until it gets to this point. They're not going to have it. Then now we need to change something drastic. Okay, Chad? Of the confrontation, you go back to Old Testament, there's a confrontation of a story. Now, the way in which he approaches it, it's a good, you have a definite sin, right? Nobody knows about that in that instance. God knows about it, which is why he sends Nathan. I'd argue that's also the nature of the punishment of why it is what it is. But when you look at what adultery is in the Old Testament, what the penalty is. But you go through that, and what does he do? He has to get him outside of himself a little bit in order to appreciate the problem. That's really what we need to do, is you have to get objective. If you just go in and make it about the two of you and anything, that's going to probably not get anywhere. It's about them and God. And that's what we try to do. Now, when they don't accept all that, and sometimes it's because maybe they've got some problem with you. And I'm telling you, you can have someone who has a big problem with you that you did nothing to deserve the way they're thinking that you're the problem. That happens. But that means they need somebody else. Okay? That's the process. Here though, we've gotten to the end of the process. And they're still in their sin. And that's why you have to turn them over to Satan, meaning there's no more pretending. Stop pretending that they belong here. Stop pretending like they're an active, solid member of this congregation. Because they're not. And your pretending is not going to make it any better, and your pretending that they are is not going to make them that way. How do I know that? Because Paul, by inspiration, says so. He tells us what's going to be necessary. And that is changing the situation to highlight the distance. That something has to change so that those social things. Now, there's something important here, and right as I bring this up, I'm thinking, boy, those next two verses are going to be hard to get to. But you look at what has to change to get their attention. Devin?
I must slow you down, but in terms of, like, it's not only just pretending is not only not going to help them, but pretending is also going to, like, in this context, going to hurt you.
Mm-hmm.
That's what the pretending is also doing.
Yes. That's a good point. Going back to verses 6 through 8, is that pretending that hurts you because it brings down your understanding of what the church is, what the standards of the church are, what the morality in most cases those are. And so, yes, it changes the dynamic, the culture of the whole congregation. Now, there's one other thing that's implied in this that is extremely important and yet often overlooked. Because people will often say when you start talking about church discipline, say, well, that doesn't work. And usually my answer, I'll tell you, is going to be this. No, practice the way we've been practicing it, it will never work. Because we've not been doing it the way God says to do it. If we try to oversimplify it and make it just an announcement, usually that's made long after it should have been done, when they don't even care. The whole point here is, though the ties are still in place socially, that also means that for any kind of church discipline to work, you have to have strong cohesion of unity as a people and an identity where every single member feels tied together. If you're just, these individuals scattered throughout an auditorium that come in like we do to that movie, and you're here to watch the show every week, yeah, that won't ever work. Guess what? I think he addressed that in the first 4 chapters. There's a reason why he addressed the unity problem before he gets to the moral problem. We need to be so tied together and united about what God says and what God wants and have that identity firm so that when someone is outside of it, it will be clear and that we are ready to act as a unit on it. Here's what happens. We know that there's a problem with someone. Oftentimes, some members know long before the leadership knows. Maybe don't say anything, either to the person or to the leadership, so nothing is done. Meanwhile, people think that they know, so those people don't talk. That person's not getting addressed. They're getting hardened in their sin because no one's talking to them about it. Finally, we find out, so now we need to do something. But you see, it only works if they lose something they love. Church discipline works because you've built a tightness and a doing things. It's the people that are closest to the people in sin that are most needed to be involved in church discipline. Because their change toward that person is going to mean the most. We cannot all go all out together every week, though it'd be fun to try that at a restaurant sometime. Can't usually do that, okay? And the fact is that you tend to have your groups you go out with a little bit more than others, right? Then you have a greater responsibility. But we all have a responsibility. Church discipline oftentimes doesn't work because it's not being practiced by all the members. Again, we talk about it, we'll have a sermon on it, we'll point it out, we'll have an announcement, try to get people to talk. Maybe a few do. Phone call, text. Those people need a face-to-face conversation with as many people as possible. Why? Because they need to understand and feel the connection they're about to lose. And if we're not interconnected, they don't lose anything. That's why the strength of our fellowship is actually key to being successful at church discipline. It's implied within this text. All right, verse 12. For what have I to do with judging those also who are outside? Do you not judge those who are inside? There you are, Star. There is judgment there. He says, okay, he's answering the question of basically saying, why would you think that I'm talking about you need to be making sure and judging all those people outside the congregation? Boy, you're wrong. Well, yeah. They've never hardly listened to the gospel, appreciated the gospel, and they never obeyed the gospel. What do you expect? So he's basically arguing and saying, why would you think that? But then he flips it on them. You're thinking about all of this. Okay? What is it? Why do you think it's be my responsibility as an apostle to focus on all these other people? He's out there. Remember, Paul is out there teaching the lost as much as he possibly can. That's different than judging them in this context. Why? Because judgment implies an accepted standard with consequences. Okay? The final consequences is that's up to God, isn't it? This is going to be important moving forward as well. Okay, so what is he pointing out? Do you not judge those who are inside? Wait a minute. You're wanting to act like, for me, that I ought to be concerning myself with condemning everyone or doing all this on the outside of the church. He says, you have a responsibility that he just outlined, and he is now here calling it a form of judgment that is not only approved of by God, but required by God of his people. Because judgment means, the word judgment means to make a decision. That's really what it means. It's to make a decision. You need to make a decision. Now, the context will often tell you that the nature of those decisions, what the stronger context is, that it could be before a court but here he's just pointing out, you're not even making decisions about where people stand within the congregation. You got sin right here, and you are not willing to stand up and say that's wrong? That person needs to be addressed? That's what he's pointing out here. So he's asking this rhetorically to get their attention and saying, you need to take care of business at home. You're trying to act like you're all big and mighty and everything about taking care of this because you're pointing out what they're doing out there. And that's what you want me focused on. You need to take care of the sin inside. It's one of those things where it's easy to get up and to preach about everyone else's problems. It's easy to preach about what the people down the road are doing wrong. That's not that hard. Why? Because you agree with me that's wrong, you're not going to stone me. What's hard would be going down there and preaching it. They had a problem right there in their midst they were not willing to address. And let's all stop for a moment and say, can we understand why that'd be hard? See, if you don't appreciate the difficulty emotionally, you'll never get there. If you act like this is an easy thing, then it's no wonder we never get there, do it. Of course this is a hard thing. Because if we've developed the closeness we need, we care about that person, and we're watching this train wreck happen. And it's killing us. But if we're not that close, we don't notice the train wreck, and we don't feel it when they're gone. That says that we've never plugged them in, and that we're not fulfilling that part of tying everyone together. Okay, Chad, I think I saw your hand.
The main thing that I have seen over the years is people are so afraid of the unknown, and they're afraid that if I talk to them, it's going to end in disaster. Mm-hmm. Then it's my fault.
Okay, yeah.
They never think about what the positive wins and how many times
Okay. Okay, well, I think you're right. I think the problem is we're basing it too much on our own experience. And that's why I wanted to start with, we haven't actually experienced this done well very often. that's what you need to look at. But there also needs to be a strengthening about an understanding about it's this person's decision to make. Our responsibility is to do everything in our power to then, number one, talk to them, acknowledge them. If it means that we need to apologize for not including them and not being aware of them and paying enough attention to them, then do it. But whatever, because they're going to have, trust me, there's going to be an airing of grievances. All right? In most cases, that person, even when they know they're wrong, there's going to be an airing of grievances about everyone else that's wrong. You'll find out some great information about the dirty laundry in the congregation going to talk to these people because they know it all, or think they do. But you've got to, at some point, get to where they understand. They need to understand the process, and that the judgment you're making, the decision you're making, is one that God has told you you must do. All you're doing is obeying what God tells you to do. Why? Because Paul, if you go back earlier in this chapter, notice what he had said. He had told them he's already judged. Verse 3. Paul has already had a judgment on what needed to be done. They hadn't. They needed to get on board with it, which is what he does here in this chapter, saying, you need to get together. Why? Because we're more worried about the difficulties of the confrontation than we are the soul. We are worried about saying all the right things rather than doing all the right things. If you love the person, then you approach them in love, and you just be honest with them about why you're doing that and what that means has to change. And it means some things in your relationship have to change. We can't go out like we used to. We can't do this. Tracy? Okay, good, I have that down. Can I read verse 13 before I answer? Okay, thank you. But those who are outside, God judges. That's his. God's going to take care of that situation. But there's something closer knit about within the church. Why? Because these people already accepted the standard. You have a basis to have a discussion with them, or should have. And that's why God says this is on your plate now. And then he says, therefore put away from yourselves the evil person, which is the final statement of what he had said at the very first about handing him over to Satan and then purge out the unleavened and don't be mixed up together with him. Here's what he says you have to do. And it's the same word that he had used from the very beginning about putting away. Now Tracy was asking about, say it again now so that I've got that out. Okay, how does this look in practice if it's a family member? Okay, this is tough but what you have to do is you have to recognize the things that are distinctly family things versus those things that are Christian things. Okay, distinctly Christian. For example, if you have a husband who has sinned, everything's fine in the marriage, the husband has sinned openly, he's withdrawn from. That needs to take place. What is the wife to do? Is she to leave him? No. No. That's not an approved reason for leaving. He's going to get to that a little bit in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Okay? That's not an approved reason. Does she say, okay, I'm going to sit, put at the table and I'll eat in the kitchen? No. Why? Because that's a family thing. And I would argue that if you put those things together with 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 1, the whole point there is that it's the proper behavior of continuing to do what is a responsibility within what God wants you to do as, and that says, a spouse, still goes. But that person has opportunity in going about that to never indicate. There ought to be a conversation. And it ought to start with, we are married, I love you, and I will continue to love you, and I'm going to continue to act as your spouse in every way I can. Matter of fact, I'm going to try to be better. But you need to understand that I'm in complete agreement with the congregation that you're lost and that you need to make this right. And that's the context. You see, part of what goes on is we don't want to have difficult conversations. And we push them aside or we store them up inside. Both of those are really bad. Because they put it up and it ends up just creating tension, either outside or inside. John? Yes. Absolutely. This was written to the congregation in Corinth, and when they received this, you have to understand, this probably would have been sitting up, he's going to read it, and the people were probably present. The whole thing was they hadn't left the congregation. They were still there. We want to let them leave and wait till they'll leave so that then we can say something about them. That's not how this works. It's when they're wrong and they're in sin and it needs to be addressed. Again, you do as much behind the scenes first. But if it comes to it, then yes, here you go, brother so-and-so, sister and so-and-so. Y'all are in sin. And that needs to stop. And Paul's telling us here what's going to change, and that's going to change. Now, bell's about to ring before long, the first bell. But I want us to realize that if we go to 2 Corinthians chapter 2, this worked. Matter of fact, Paul had to write to them and tell them to, hey, y'all need to welcome him back in and everything. They were, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to have anything to do with him. Paul had to write back again and say, yeah, you need to reverse course on this now. Because his behavior changed, so your behavior should change. We're having to change our behavior. We're forced into this action in order to point out the sin. That's a judgment that God has made about wrong, that we're acknowledging something that God has said is wrong, and that we are following correctly to do something God says to do when something's wrong. We're just making the judgments according to his word about what's required. And that's what he's getting to. So he says at the close, he says, therefore put away from yourselves the evil person. First thing is, he didn't call him that loving brother, did he? He called him a wicked person. That was probably for their benefit too. Don't minimize the sin. The whole point is to recognize that sin is a big deal. And we hurt ourselves and we hurt the person, we hurt the congregation when we don't act like it's a big deal. Because here's what happens. If we treat it as a little deal, then doing this seems like we've gone overboard. But we haven't. What we've done is we have undersold the sin for the problem it is. Instead of pointing out, this is a big problem. You got a soul in jeopardy here. It is time for us to come together and do something to save this soul. Because that's what the church does. We're in the soul-saving business. I tell people we're the soul-saving business and the soul-resaving business. Okay. Every activity we do should be in one way or another designed around seeing that a soul is saved. And that's what he is getting to in all of this. Now, again, process. It's with Tracy's question, it becomes more difficult when you go out. What do you do when it's extended family? You see, if they're at home, then that's one thing. And you can do certain, depending upon what's going on, that you're limited. You've still got family obligations. Just depending upon the tie, you're going to have some obligations within that as family, even though they've left home, correct? So the question is how do we then tie in to where when they're in sin, that fulfilling a family obligation does not, and that there's still some distinction there, So that something needs to be pulled back even from family so that they feel it, while not neglecting what are familial obligations. See, what the problem, why this is hard, is we have to take everything here, accept it in its totality, but also look at all of the other things that Scripture says in principle, and that they're still true when we get to 1 Corinthians 5. And now we're saying, what we do is we want to pick, we're really bad sometimes about picking one verse or chapter over another. Here's what I'm going to obey this chapter now, and I'm going to obey this chapter. No, they all are to be obeyed all the time. They're to be followed all the time. So they have to go together, or else we're misunderstanding them. They have to all mesh. So there can be love and judgment. And matter of fact, when you ignore the sin and to judge the sin, you have also failed to love. Because you're choosing to leave a soul lost, that you know is lost, to make it easier on you. That's not love. Remember, the core idea of agape love is building relationships. Do what it takes to build the right kind of relationships. Here's a relationship that's gone off the rails. It needs to be fixed. So you have to fix the sin problem. And this is sometimes what it takes. So having said all that, though, it is so much to be preferred if we will be so active at dealing with these problems as early as possible. My personal desire would be that we'd never reach this point. That's what I would love to have be the case, that we never reach this point. Because we're so good and active about seeing people, knowing people, seeing them when they're struggling, when they're into sin, we know it, hear about it, and we're on to it. And we come together as a group of God's people to deal with it. And we bring as many people in immediately, whatever the closest people, and then we move forward so that it never comes to this. But if it does, it's in the Bible, it's something to obey, and if we fail, we'll be held accountable. It is that serious. We will actually start chapter 6 next week, I promise.